The windows of Dragonstone were carved so deep into the black stone they seemed like wounds in the cliff, swallowing the last light of evening and returning it to the chamber as a dull, bruised glow. Salt wind pressed itself against the glass, and the sea below plucked at the rocks with tireless fingers. Jon stood just inside the threshold, the smell of damp basalt and extinguished torches in his nose, and met the gaze of the woman on the throne of carved obsidian as if she were one of the storms that owned this island. She wore no crown, only the steel of an old house and the unassailable quiet of someone who had crossed a world to stand where she stood. Around her, the court moved like constellations dragged low. A small woman with wise eyes and scars of slavery turned to watch him. A soldier whose spear had been polished by 100 dawns. A dwarf whose mouth was a folded map of old alleys in newer cities. A Sellsword's friend with a knight's yearning folded carefully out of sight. Above them, unseen, the dragons settled on the towers and chimneys and shivered the stone with their breathing. "You came to Dragonstone to bend the knee," Daenerys said, her voice clear in the cool air. "You leave with my protection, my army, and my fire. You came to Dragonstone to swear to your queen." Jon drew a breath and felt the cold on the back of his throat, a memory of snow on the wind. In the distance, the sea cracked against a hidden shelf, a sound like bone. He had walked halls lined with the bones of kings in the north, had knelt before lords whose breath smelled of ale and long winters, had stood in a dim tower and watched a knife held to his sister's pale throat. He had knelt for duty. He would kneel again for his people. But this was not that. "I came for Dragonglass," he said. "I came to ask your help against the dead." "You ask a queen for help," she said, "and you offer no fealty. How shall my people understand such a bargain? If they do not bend for me, I am no queen at all. If you do not bend for me, you are my enemy. That is what the world will see." Davos shifted beside him. "My queen," he began, and then corrected himself. "Your Grace, there's more to the world than what it sees. Sometimes it only sees what survives." The lad speaks true. The dead don't know the difference between kings and beggars. Jon did not take his eyes from Daenerys. He thought of the ravens Bran had sent, of the sketches on rough parchment of figures that had once been men moving through trees like a stain. He thought of the children under Winterfell, of their small fingers tangled in their mothers' cloaks. "I will fight for the living," he said. "I'll die for them, but I will not trade the North for a promise. And I will not kneel if kneeling means the North is a prize to be won." Tyrion Lannister, who had come to greet Jon on bleak sand below the cliffs, who had spoken in the voice of a man who had seen many rooms and left them with fewer enemies, cleared his throat. "If I might suggest a shape for the problem," he said, not unkindly. "The dead, I agree, are an unshapely matter, hard to put in a barrel, harder to roll downhill onto an enemy. Yet the Seven Kingdoms have always bent for strength. Sometimes strength is armies. Sometimes strength is, let us say, a story people can tell each other without choking on it. The story of a northern king who refuses the Dragon Queen is not the one that ends in unity." "The North is not a fable," Jon said. "My people remember what the fire of kings does to daughters. We remember what the South takes when it comes north with banners. They named me king, my lord, not because I asked for it, because I would not leave them in winter without a leader." Daenerys watched him with the stillness of someone listening to a distant drum. "I was born in exile," she said. "My family was overthrown while I was carried under a mother's heart. I was sold to buy a crown. I was given to a man so others could ride his horses. I walked through a pyre to claim what was mine and found only ashes and what rose from them. I have freed slaves. I have broken chains. I do not take what is not mine. But I will not be refused by a man who calls himself king because he was raised above a table by men who fear something in the snow." Jon's temper, like an iron that had spent too long in coals, glowed under his skin. "It is not fear," he said softly. "It is knowledge. If you will not help without taking the North, then you are the same as every queen who has asked the North to pay for her banners. I'll not be party to it." Silence gathered in the chamber, not heavy, but present, like a cloak laid across shoulders. The soft slither of the sea below ran its fingers under every door. Missandei, the woman with the wise eyes, spoke in a voice that seemed to understand burden. "There are many ways to give honor to a queen without bending the knee," she said. "In Noth we bend to the wind and to mercy. If your people cannot bear a southern queen, can they bear this? Pact, an oath to fight the common foe, sworn on your gods and ours, and the questions of crowns set aside until the night is broken." Daenerys did not look at her, not immediately, but a muscle in her cheek flickered like a moth in a lantern. She said, "Words are only words while wind holds them. Men have sworn to me before and run to other hearths when the food was warm and the night easy. Then let the words be carved," Tyrion said quickly, scenting the opening like a fox. "Stone remembers, an oath on the painted table, carved for those who come after us to read, and binding by the old gods and the new. He remains king in the north. You remain queen of the rest, until the dead are defeated and all the living may meet to decide the world's shape. No oaths broken, no knees bent, not yet. Only survival and perhaps a small quantity, perhaps a large quantity, of dragonglass moving north by ship." There was a long pause. Jon could feel Davos watching him and did not turn. He did not look away from the woman whose dragons shook the island with their breathing. The sea outside hissed as if it were trying to put out a fire it could not reach. At last Daenerys said, "The mines are under this castle. They have not been worked in 100 years. Take what you need. Take what you can carry. I will lend men who know the tunnels. But know this, I carry fire and blood across the narrow sea to bring peace to the 7 kingdoms. I do not carry it to be told no by men with snow in their hair. Carve your oath. I will carve mine. And when the night is ended, there will be a reckoning for all of us." It was not victory and it was not defeat. It entered Jon's chest as something like relief laced through with a warning's dull ache. He bowed, not low, not the bow of a vassal, but the bow of a man who recognizes another name for stubbornness. And when he straightened, he thought he saw, behind the iron of her face, a grief like a frozen river. They went to the painted table. Davos watched the craftsman's chisels bite into the wood and muttered about splinters, about the age of kings and the price of art. Tyrion, with a care that surprised Jon, placed a candle at each corner so the carver could see the grain. The words were plain, the way the North preferred them. "We stand together against the dead. We keep our crowns until the night ends. The North will not be forced. The South will not be refused." It was Missandei who suggested the final sentence, a soft afterthought that carried the weight of prayer. "Let no living tongue speak lies over this table." When the last curl of wood fell away, Daenerys stood for a time with her hand on the cold obsidian river that marked the neck. Her fingers rested just north of Moat Cailin. "We will need to move quickly," she said. "I am losing the South while I stand here listening to the sea inform me of my folly." That night Jon walked the basalt paths that tacked around the castle like threads laid down by some massive, patient spider. The wind was a cold hand on the back of his neck. Above him something moved, wings, weight, a body like a bellows, and Drogon slid along the sky as easily as a knife through soft bread. The dragon's eye, when it turned down to him, was as black as the tunnels beneath them, and yet that black held a ring of red like the last light under a coal. Jon watched it and thought of Ghost running across a white field and vanishing into the night. Grey Worm met him at the mouth of the mines and brought torches. Men were already at the faces, striking at the glass with tools designed for rock. The dragonglass came away like night given a hard shape. It shattered, but where it broke its insides were sharper than any lie a lord had ever told. Outside, waves folded themselves into fists and broke against the cliff. The castle hummed with strangers' footsteps. The ravens flew at dawn, their ink fingerprints drying on parchment long after they were gone. One went to Winterfell, another to Eastwatch, a third, the smallest, to a marsh village near White Harbor where a man with boatman's hands and a face used to smoke would receive it and begin his own small story. In King's Landing, a queen slept with a small smile and dreamt she was awake among the dead and loved them better than the living. Winterfell woke under a sky like a scraped blade. Sansa walked the courtyard with the stiffness of someone wearing mail under a dress. Lords waited with the nervous energy of men who had learned long ago to disguise fear as outrage. To her left, Arya's shadow was a moving needle. To her right was the hush that followed Bran wherever he slid through the world, as if the air itself thought better of making noise near him. The raven landed on the old maester's wrist bone. Sansa took the message. She read it twice, though there were few words. Eastwatch expects the winter. The mines are open. Ships will carry the glass. She did not smile. She did not allow herself to hope in public. She lifted her eyes to the courtyard, to the walls that had once been taller in her girl's memory, and said, "We will make every hammer in the north sing louder than your tongues. If you want to live to see spring, find a way to hold steel or stone. And stop shouting at the cold. It cannot hear you." Littlefinger watched her from the edge of the bailey with a mouth soft as rain, his eyes calculating under the frost. He had spent his life walking into rooms and leaving with something more valuable than he'd carried in. He found himself lately walking into rooms and leaving with less. The girl with the knife walked without a sound. The boy in the chair looked at him as if he were a fly under glass. Sansa, flame and granite, no longer tilted her head when he murmured of loyalty and debts. He did not yet believe that the North had found a way to be itself without him. He would learn. At King's Landing, Cersei walked the ramparts at sunrise because it allowed her to pretend the city lay in all directions and not just down, and because from above the life of fleas and peddlers and guards looked like a mosaic she could rearrange by plucking pieces free with 2 fingers. Qyburn followed her steps with the patience of dust. News came to her like wine poured carefully. The Unsullied at Casterly Rock, the Lannister army already gone. Highgarden's deep bright vaults stripped dry of their gold. Lady Olenna dead, though in the moment of her dying she had insisted on setting the stone that would topple the pillar. Cersei imagined it falling and placed her foot on the parapet as if she could hold everything up with her heel. Euron's fleet shrieked under gulls and sunlight, sails black as spilled ink on a ledger. He had Yara tied under his figurehead so other captains would look up from their decks and see the Iron Price smiling. Cersei welcomed him as one welcomes a knife to a table when the other guests have insisted on pairing there. Food with coins. He bowed too low and promised everything and let his eyes climb her dress like ivy. She watched him as one might watch a storm, amused unless it insists upon one's roof. While ships skated across green water, the North learned to hold the night in its hands. Gendry Baratheon, who had been waiting for a hammer his whole life without knowing it, sweated among the forges and made fire speak to stone. Davos stood beside him, offering water in a voice that sounded like he had invented thirst. The boy had arms like bridge cables and a laugh like a man who had found something honest to do. He swung the hammer as if it were an apology offered to his own bones. When Jon arrived at the forge after riding through snow that stung like sand, Gendry lifted a dragonglass spearhead to the light and said, "This one's straight. Most of them aren't. The glass likes to decide for itself how it wants to break." "So do people," Davos said dryly. Jon took the spearhead carefully and felt the cold in it. "How many can we make by the time the ships arrive?" Gendry shrugged, and the movement sent sweat sliding off his neck. "Enough for men with arms to lift them," he said. "Not enough for ghosts." Tormund came down from Eastwatch with his beard full of snow and his arms full of news. He found Jon in the hall, where a fire clawed at a log and did not yet win. "Saw them," he said, not to say it to anyone else first, as if speaking it to the man the free folk called Crow would make the words stay in a place where men could fight them. "They're not bothering with the forest. They're coming along the shore. I don't know what word to use for what the sea's doing. It's like it's turning to stone with a mind to walk." Jon closed his eyes. "They'll go around the Eastwatch? They'll go around everything if the wind helps them," Tormund said. "The ice is knitting itself like broken bone. You can hear it. That sound? That's the world deciding to stop moving." The weather obeyed nothing. It blew good men into ditches and piled snow onto roofs everyone had believed would hold. Sentries on the shadowed ramparts of Winterfell felt the cold burrow into their teeth. The ravens returning to the castle struck the air with wings that looked too thin to cut it. Every day dragged a little light behind it and let it fall early. When the first small dead things crossed the Bay of Seals and reached a black shore, The men who found them were fishermen whose hands were older than their faces, and they did not scream because they had always known that winter had opinions about the living. Jon stood at the map and moved stones with his fingers. The tiny bear of House Mormont he placed at the head of a line of spears. The wolf he set in the crook of the neck and felt his throat tighten. Sansa stood beside him with her hands empty, and that was a decision, not a failure. They slept too little and woke knowing they had not dreamed enough of solutions. By the time Daenerys brought her army north, the sky was a lid and the world a pot trying not to boil. The Unsullied moved across the snow as if it were a language they had been taught in childhood. The Dothraki rode as if they were hunting the air. Drogon and Rhaegal slid into Winterfell's shadow with the noise of cloth tearing. Children ran from the yard shrieking laughter that ended quickly when their mothers' hands found their shoulders. The dragons perched, one on the tower with the broken soul, one on the rookery, and watched the movements of men with the cool speculation of things that had survived longer. Daenerys descended from her horse with a stiffness that Jon recognized. She had been riding for days, pressing herself against the wind, refusing to hunch into it. The hood she pushed back left frost caught like pearls in her hair. Her face was thinner and sharper than it had been at Dragonstone. There were lines around her mouth that had not existed before the road north. She looked at Winterfell as if she could hear the stones thinking about whether to accept her. "Winterfell welcomes you," Sansa said when welcomes had to be spoken, and if the sentence held no warmth it at least held no poison. "Thank you," Daenerys answered. She saw the girl who had once wanted songs enough to mistake them for news, and she saw a queen. "I did not bring my court," she added, the ghost of humor present around her mouth. "They would not thank me for the weather." Tyrion, muffled to the eyes, shivered. "My court is my body's memory of heat," he said. "It has gone to a place I cannot follow." They set their tents outside the walls where there was room for a world to breathe and for fear to settle if it wished. In the great hall, men and women ate food that had traveled in salted barrels across rough water and tasted of gratitude enough to hide the salt. The dragons hunted the sky for scant prey and returned with the smell of burning frozen hairs in their nostrils like the absurd coda to a grand theme. Jon stood on the battlements the night before the first true storm arrived. He looked north and thought of the tree in the gods' wood, its winter leaves blood against snow. He thought of the boy whose shadow no longer kept its shape. He thought of the girl with needle, whose voice had lost its child's edge and gained a clarity like scraping. He thought of the woman below, sleeping near strangers, the invitation of warmth and the betrayal of heat. He did not think of bending knees or of crowns. He thought of holding back a tide. The storm came not as a white wall but as a concentration of purpose. It licked at the torches and ate them. It made the watchfire outside the walls a suggestion rather than a certainty. The first ranks of the dead were wrong at the edges, like a painting that had been left in rain and then redrawn by a careful hand who had not seen the originals. The whites moved with the clumsy hunger Jon remembered, and in their mass there was the fury of winter being forced to stay in one place rather than spread itself evenly upon everything. Behind them, far behind, in a ripple in the night that could be felt at the root of teeth, were the white shapes that led them, and behind those colder still was the idea of a man who had forgotten his own name and worn the ice in his veins like a crown. They lit the trenches when the first dead fell into them, and the flames ate the snow until it hissed black. Drogon swept across the front line and rolled heat into the dark, and some small part of Jon's mind counted the heartbeats between Drogon's pass and the moment when the wind took the heat and replaced it with cold. Men shouted. Steel answered bone with its own speech, a higher, thinner sound. The dragonglass spearheads shattered in cold hands and made more spears. The Unsullied kneaded the front lines like bakers working a desperate dough. The Dothraki rode in and out of sight, became flames on the plain, and became screams swallowed by the storm. In the godswood Bran sat in his chair and stared not at the weirwood but through it. The carved face above him was older than any tongue he had learned to use. Theon stood in front of him with a bow he had not earned in any proper school, and a jaw set the way it had been set around a scream in another life. He shifted his weight in the snow and found a place where he could be a man for perhaps a quarter of an hour. "I've seen that look before," he said to Bran softly. "On the prow of a ship before a storm, on my father's face when he was remembering an old tide." Bran said, almost disinterested. "He remembers nothing now. Memory is a different animal where he walks." Then the world bent. It did not quite crack. It changed the angle of its shoulders to carry a different burden. The wind fell for the space of an inhale. The torches on the battlements did not gutter so much as imitate stillness. From the north, across fields packed with 1,000 stiffening angles, the silence came like a hand finding a throat. Through it walked the Night King, and there was a distance around him that was not physical but real enough to trip a running man. He did not look left or right. He looked forward as if the blades and fires and men were only a landscape, a series of hills and rivers on a map he had long ago memorized. The White Walkers moved at his flanks. Tall, lean, their eyes an old, unlit color carried out of deep water. Drogon fell out of the sky like an answer. Fire roared around the Night King and did nothing to him at all that men's ears could hear. The heat made the snow under him collapse and then freeze again. The Night King looked up, not in surprise, not even really in acknowledgement, as if someone had spoken in a language he did not need. Daenerys rode the dragon as if she had discovered how to trust the way a storm trusts itself. She felt the heat under her legs, the scales shifting like coins sliding over coins, and she drew her breath in and tasted iron and snow. Somewhere, far away, Missandei's voice told her a story about bells in a coastal city, about mercy, about the shape of conquest. She pulled Drogon up and away because to dwell on a poor question is to waste an answer. Jon fought. He forgot, as men who wish to live must forget, to count. He moved. He found the space between one wight's reach and the next wight's hunger, and into that space he put Longclaw. The sword sang in his hand, and for a moment he heard another song, the sound of steel kissing glass years ago in a place where there had been no winter. He wrenched the blade free and turned and found the hound there suddenly, and in his face was a loathing for flame that had learned, painfully, to tolerate necessity. "Your queen's pretty fire didn't do much to him," the hound grunted. "Got anything with more teeth?" Jon had a blade with more history. He had a plan with more teeth only in that it involved a wolf and a girl with a ledger full of names and a boy who had stepped away from his body so many times it had begun to remember darkness. They lured the Night King to the Godswood because the Godswood had roots, and roots remember. Bran's face, when the Night King stepped into the grove, was not quite human. Theon loosed and loosed and loosed until the sinews in his shoulder begged him, but he would not stop because there were debts that required all your arrows. He finally put the bow down and took up a spear. He looked at Bran and said, with a sense that he had at last arrived somewhere that would not throw him from its doors, "It was always for this," and charged and broke like foam on rock. He did not scream. Daenerys saw it from above, the god's eye view men imagine for gods. She had misliked the tightness of Tyrion's mouth when they had spoken of plans, had pitted his cleverness because clever men win wars and lose people. Now she understood that what they had made was not a plan but a trap built from rumors and a hope that the Night King's attention could be bled away from the masses long enough for a single pinprick to find the one place where all the winter was knotted. Jon came into the grove with the cold on his shoulders like a yoke. The air in the Godswood was unkind. Snow lay on the branches like memory and did not melt even when he drew near. He lifted Longclaw, and that was not courage but habit. The Night King looked at him once as if to place him in a long ledger of men who had thought their lives mattered to anything larger than ice. Jon stepped forward. He did not reach the Night King. He reached 3 steps beyond where he had thought to stand, because that was where he was told to stand, and then he stopped because a thin shape passed him like a shadow deciding to be a body again. Arya had made a habit of vanishing, but in the act of appearing she was a truth so sharp it bent the world around it. She leaped and her breath was a string pulled tight, a single note. The dagger in her hand was a story with a long tale. It had started in another war and moved through lives like a small god choosing sacrifices. The Night King turned with a slowness that would have been comical if it had not been the force of winter shifting its attention. His hand found her throat but not her wrist. The blade fell and was found again by the hand that had learned to see in the dark. It went into the place below his breastbone, and the sound it made was like a glass thrown into black water. He shattered in silence. The White Walkers shattered with him, light soundlessly breaking into smaller light, then into nothing. Beyond the Godswood, across fields where men were still dying in the dark because news travels like blood and needs a heart to push it, the Whites fell the way children fall asleep standing up. The snow, freed from a shape imposed by a mind that did not care about it, remembered how to be cold without malice. There were dead enough to make a ledger. There were names that would not be spoken for a time because tongues have ruled that grief must be rationed. Yora died with his queen's hands on his face, and she felt, through gloves stiff with cold, the heat leaving him like a lie thrown down next to a truth and deciding to stop pretending. Lyanna Mormont killed a giant with a scream that came from a grandmother in her bones, and then succumbed not in the belly of a beast but in the story of herself. And that is a good death to a warrior. The Dothraki who had once thought of winter as a story told to make children hurry home found out it was a story that could be ridden until your horse's breath froze in its mane, and then release you to whatever field lay beyond bravado. Davos, who had once smuggled onions past men who would have killed him and then thanked him, stood on the battlements with his sword held low and watched the sun try to pry a morning out of a grudging sky. They burned their dead slowly because the wood was hard to come by, because in the act of building pyres the living reassure themselves that there are tasks left even when the enemy no longer breathes, because stacking wood is easier than counting absence. The air smelled like old memories and new ashes. Daenerys knelt in the snow alone because grief must sometimes be alone to discover the words it needs. Drogon watched her from a tower and lowered his head, and between them hung a grief older than language and freer of politics. In the days that followed, the North held its breath not because it was frightened but because it was thinking. The living had survived the night, and that survival opened doors for old arguments to come back inside. Sansa took off her gloves in the great hall and felt the splinters of the table. Her father had once leaned over and made decisions that smelled of wet fur and iron. She looked to her left at Arya, whose eyes had learned to live without blinking, and to her right at Bran, who did not always seem to inhabit the chair he was in. She glanced beyond them and found Jon at the edge of the hall, as if he could not prevent himself from gravitating toward exits. "He saved us," a lord announced and lifted a cup to Jon. "We saved ourselves," Sansa said mildly. "Both can be true," said Tyrion, seated further down the table, lines of calculation and compassion playing tug-of-war on his face. He had watched the battle from the wall, had done the mathematics of fear, and admitted in his heart that he did not understand the sums that winter demanded. He had also watched a girl kill a king of night and decided that every plan he made from now on would include the possibility of miracles. Daenerys did not ask, not that night, for anyone to bend. She watched Jon across the hall with the look of someone trying to assess whether a fire is too big for the hearth it occupies. Men approached her to swear thanks. Women approached her to press small tokens into her hands, pieces of cloth, carved wood, a ring that had warmed one finger for 30 winters and would now warm no one. She carried the tokens in her pockets as if they were stones that would keep her from floating off into a sky that did not always forgive her flights. On the third day, Bran asked to speak with Jon alone. Jon had begun to avoid Bran because when he stood next to him, he felt like a boy who had stolen something from a temple and didn't know how to return it. They went to the Godswood, and the heart tree's red leaves twitched though there was no wind. Bran looked at Jon with a calm that might have been cruelty if there had been any pride in it. "There is a story you should know," he said. Samwell came out of the trees with a book pressed to his chest. He had arrived the day after the battle with the smell of paper in his hair and the look of a man who had made a decision at last. "I didn't come quickly enough to be brave," he said, "but I know things. Gilly knows more than I do, but I know some things." They told Jon what he had suspected since the world began to tilt under him in places where there were no hills. They told him his name. They told him his father had been a man who had built upon honor and then, for the sake of the living, had laid a great lie upon it. They told him his mother had died to deliver him into a world that had given him brothers and a house to love, and then demanded he bleed for it until something else could be born. They told him he had a claim to a chair made of swords and an answer to a riddle he had not wanted to ask. Jon listened. The words entered him and moved around and could not find a place to settle. He had known himself all his life as a bastard of Winterfell, bound by a promise he had not made. Now he was a prince of old Valyria's last breath, bound by a different promise. He did not think of crowns, not first. He thought of Daenerys looking up into a night full of his enemy and refusing to cry. He thought of Sansa's wary intelligence and Arya's sharp, small smile and Bran's cool gaze. He thought of how many times he had presumed to beg men to risk their lives on his word. He told no one for 2 days. Then he told his sisters because he did not know who else to be in the world except a brother first. Sansa's face moved through surprise to calculation and then to something like grief for him. Arya's mouth quirked. "You can call yourself whatever you like," she said. "If we're keeping what matters, you're still you." And then, after a beat, with a twist of humor that cut, "If you start wearing silk robes and speaking riddles, I'll stab you, though." They told Daenerys because it had to be told to her, because if she found out from a mouth that was not his, it would poison the small piece that had been born in the fire. Jon found her on Winterfell's ramparts with Drogon curled like a cat around a tower, smoke leaking from his nostrils as if he dreamed of burnings he had already carried out. Snow had settled on Daenerys' shoulders and did not melt at once. She listened the way he had. She looked at him as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff she had convinced herself she would never fall from. He spoke plainly because he lacked the words for lies. "I don't want it," he said. "I wanted last night. I wanted to live through it and wake to see what the world looks like when the white is gone. I don't want a throne. I don't want you to be my enemy." "You are my enemy," she said softly, and then closed her eyes. "Not because I want it, because the world does. The story changes when a man like you stands in it." "Stories can be made," Jon said. "We wrote one together. You gave us your fire. I gave you my trust." And because the words came without asking him if they could, he added, "If I have to swear, I swear the North will keep its crown and leave you yours. That was the oath. I will swear it again on every tree in this godswood." The look she gave him was not kind or cruel. It was grief holding hands with practicality. "The South is not a patient lover," she replied. "Cersei is rebuilding her lies while we count our dead. She has ships with lion prows and men with nowhere else to spend their cruelty. I need to break her. Once the South is mine, perhaps the story can be written to let you keep your snow." "Not perhaps," Jon said, and his voice had iron under it he wasn't accustomed to hearing there. "If you come north with iron again, we will fight you. If you go south and win and remember what we burned together, we will call you queen. But we will not kneel. I will not." "Then we are allies with conditions," she said. For now. Varys's hands had always been gentle. He used them to write letters that drifted like snowflakes into fires across the kingdoms. He did not write poetry or proclamation. He wrote the facts that he had collected the way other men collect debts. He wrote of a boy with a bastard's name who was no bastard, of a claim that would make banners turn their faces to a different wind. He did not see the ravens go. He did not know how many. He slept poorly and dreamed of a young girl who had once asked him if men could be better and of his answer. Tyrion watched him with eyes that had learned to measure betrayal not by its volume but by its targets. He took no joy in leaving marks in the snow with his steps as he went to tell Daenerys what he suspected. He did not enjoy the flicker of fire in her eyes. He did not enjoy watching the careful tower they had been building begin to list. "He thinks he serves the realm," he said when she asked him why. "Sometimes we make monsters out of men who love the realm because it's easiest. Sometimes those men make themselves into monsters because they decide what the realm must be without asking the realm. He believes he sees something the rest of us are too frightened to look at." Missandei stood a little behind Daenerys, her face grave. "We cannot forbid men to love their homes," she murmured. "We can only ask them to love justice more." In the end, Daenerys did the thing she knew how to do. She cut with fire. Varys died on a beach, the sea nearby muttering its old stories as if reminding everyone present that everything is borrowed. He met death with the quiet of a man who had always known he would not survive the truths he collected. Tyrion watched with his jaw set and thought of a girl with silver hair riding out of a city of bones with a future on her back. He thought of wine and ashes and what it costs to keep promises to strangers. The war against Cersei did not wait for grief. It had corsairs to pay and a fleet to burn and a golden company to hire. Euron struck in the bay near Dragonstone with bolts that turned the sky into a trap. Rhaegal screamed and spun. Blood fell like rain that would never evaporate. Daenerys yanked Drogon hard, felt a bolt graze heat and scale and pass into cruel air. She tasted copper. Missandei, captured in the chaos, was carried to King's Landing and placed on the wall above a crowd that did not yet know what it was seeing. Grey Worm stood below with his hands at his sides and felt something inside him trying to break the rules he had given it. The Mountain in Red stood beside the small queen whose drink had never run dry during siege. The parley was a lesson in the shapes grief can take. Tyrion walked forward onto packed earth and looked up at his sister. For a moment he remembered a time when her cruelty had been small and domestic. It had fit into rooms. Then he remembered a father with a crossbow bolt in him and decided that the past had always been pretending to be manageable. He asked for mercy and was refused. Qyburn, who liked to call it pragmatism, had the decency not to smirk when Missandei's head fell into a world that still had room for awe. Grey Worm's face did not change. There are deserts where men learn not to weep because water is for the living. Daenerys flew such fury that night that even Drogon seemed surprised at how hurt the sky could be. She wanted to melt Teach, Red keep into a red pool and watch Cersei wade in it until she learned that the shape of a crown is only a shape. Tyrion stood before her, and if he did not stop her, he slowed her, just enough. "The bells," he said. "When they ring, the city surrenders. Burn the scorpions, burn the ships, burn the soldiers who keep burning alive as their trade. But when the bells ring, accept the thing you have asked for. Leave them people to bury their dead and begin again." "Why should they be allowed to begin again?" she asked, not so much hard as exhausted. "Because we need someone to sing to," he said, half a joke, half a confession. "And because the world will remember what you give it to remember." The battle for King's Landing began in smoke. Drogon fell out of the sun and made the scorpions look, for a short time, like clever toys. He destroyed them with a contempt that felt like relief. The Golden Company broke at the Dragon Gate because it had not expected to face a mind that understood not only war but hunger. The Unsullied moved like black needles through white cloth. The Dothraki broke themselves on packed earth and put themselves back together a quarter hour later because rage has its own rules. Euron's fleet died noisily in the bay, its ships slamming into each other like rich men at a narrow door. The Red Keep smoked. Cersei watched from a window with a calm she summoned the way other people summon servants. She held her belly with one hand and thought of nothing but staying upright while the world jumped under her. The bells rang. They ran through the air like a snake with bells on it and wound themselves around Daenerys' chest. She felt them. She made Drogon turn above the city like a choice writing its own name. She looked down at people in streets who had learned long ago to tell the difference between danger and disaster. She wanted to burn them the way she wanted, sometimes to burn the ocean for daring to separate continents. She did not. She pulled the dragon up and threw him at the Red Keep like a dart at a single, appropriate throat. The keep buckled. Stone let go of stone the way grudges let go when there is no one left to hold them. The roof came down hat by hat. Cersei turned and saw the hall where her father had placed her hand on a map and told her to be a lion become a cave. She saw Jaime in her mind and for the first time did not know whether she loved him, hated him, or merely understood that all stories require an ending. She descended. She did not find him. She did not find mercy. She died with the smell of her city in her lungs and the sound of bells, a memory severed from sound. The Hound climbed a stairway that had once supported kings and now supported only men who had made a profession of killing. He found his brother at the top. A mountain turned into a man by science and spite. The sky above them made their armor bright. The fight would have been funny for those who liked to watch God's box, except that it was not funny. It was ugly and honest and ended in fire because that is what the Hound had always owed himself. Arya followed him far enough to be told to leave and then left, because there are debts one must let others pay for themselves. She ran through the streets as if she were a little girl again and discovered that even little girls cannot outrun falling cities. She got clear with a cough and a name somewhere in her throat that she promised herself she would not forget. When it was done, the city breathed smoke. The dead lay, this time, warm. The living stumbled. The Red Keep wore a crown of dust. Daenerys landed Drogon on the hill below where the Targaryen sigil had once snapped in a cleaner wind and walked into the ruin with shoulders that did not bow under everyone's eyes standing on them. She did not accept the sword of surrender from a man with ash in his mustache because there was no one left whose surrender mattered. She raised no banners because the wind would not hold them. She stood and did not tremble. Tyrion walked behind her with a heart that had survived more often than it had wished to. In the days that followed, the South became quiet insofar as a city with smoke in its lungs can be quiet. Daenerys sat in a room with one unbroken window and let people come to her to offer service or malice or fear. She did not sit the Iron Throne. She walked past it as if it were an embarrassing heirloom and stood before a new chair carved from woods that had not grown in Westeros. She spoke of laws that would not allow men to buy children with land. She spoke of justice that would not be the same in Dorne as it was in the Riverlands because justice should be made to fit people and not the other way around. She sent riders into the country with proclamations and commanded that grain be taken from rich men's storehouses and put into mouths that had been hungry all the time bells were ringing. She did not forget the North. She did not trust it either. A council formed by necessity, then by napkin, then by seal. Yohn Royce arrived and stood like a hill in polished mail. Edmure Tully found his way out of his scrapes and into a seat at the polished table of state and looked around as if expecting someone to tell him he was in the wrong room. Yara Greyjoy walked with a limp nobody was permitted to mention and spoke in the flat tones of a person who had learned speech in storms. A Dornish envoy with eyes like cracked olives reclined as if he were already bored with the future. Sansa came when she decided the invitation had waited long enough on tables in rooms she did not sit in. She came dressed as the North dressed its queens, with fur and memory. She brought Arya, who sat quietly and cut bread in tidy slices with a dagger whose history was as long as the tables. Bran did not come. He was present in ways other than the obvious. The question of fealty hung over them like a badly hung tapestry. Everyone pretended not to see it until Tyrion tired of the pretending and pointed to it as one points to a stain. The North, he said, saved the South without asking for any payment. The South saved itself by bending to an army that was not its own. We are here to discuss whether we are all produced by the same story henceforth, or by many. Jon did not sit at the table. He stood near a window, as if he might leave if leaving became necessary. He did not say much. When he did, he said, "The dead are dead. My oaths are alive. The North does not bend." He looked up and met Daenerys' eyes after he spoke, and in them was a plea that had nothing to do with fear. Daenerys' gaze did not move from Sansa when she answered. "The North refuses the crown I wear. The North will refuse any crown it does not hand to itself," she said. "Very well. Let the North be a kingdom again. Let it name its own kings and send envoys to my court as equals. Let it guard the wall and keep the old gods from being forgotten by children who have only ever heard laughter in warm rooms." She turned then to Jon. "I will not demand the thing the story says I should demand, but I will ask for something else." Sansa's mouth tightened. "You will ask for our soldiers," she said. "You will ask for our food in bad harvests. You will ask for our killable men." Daenerys shook her head. "I will ask for your honesty," she said. "When the South is wrong, tell me. When I become the thing I crossed the sea to kill, tell me. When your people suffer because of something I do, send a letter not to a lord 3 seats down the table but to me. I will answer you myself. I will come north if I must. I will be queen of the South, not queen of my own reflection." She breathed in a small human thing. "And I will ask for one more thing. I will ask him not to sit a throne He does not want, but also not to be used as a thorn in my side by people who prefer to see my feet bleed. That will be difficult, Tyrion said dryly. It usually is, Missandei might have said, and for a moment the room was full of a woman who was gone. Jon looked at the table as if he could see through it to a river running underneath. I don't want to be used, he said. He looked at Sansa. He looked at Arya. I don't want to rule. I never did. Sansa does. She will do it better than I could, because she will not make the mistake of trusting men like me to be what they cannot be. Sansa's eyes widened as if he had taken a knife out of his pocket and handed it to her hilt first. She did not reach for it immediately. You abdicate? She asked, testing the word in her mouth. Jon nodded. I give the crown to you. I will go where I belong, north of the wall, with the free folk for a time. Someone should make sure the world stays broken in the right places. The North will know you speak for it. The free folk will know you do not forget them. The South will learn that there are ways to be a king that look like other things. That is not a way to be a king at all, Yohn Royce said, baffled and vaguely moved. It is a way to be Jon, Arya murmured, and that settled it for the North. The pact they made was not simple. It was a braid. The North was a kingdom again. The South was 6 kingdoms binding themselves to a queen who had made a habit of breaking chains and needed now to learn the delicate work of tying them without making nooses. Dorne kept its peculiarities and promised men when it could spare them. The Iron Islands promised raids only against enemies designated on maps with agreed-upon pins. The Riverlands stretched and sighed and asked to be left alone to fix their bridges. The West counted its coins and tried to resist the urge to eat its children when the rains didn't come. The Reach, absent House Tyrell's old flowers, planted new seeds in different patterns. The Stormlands sent a Baratheon boy back to his father's ruined halls with a hammer and a crown that fit like a promise rather than a trap. Brienne of Tarth was made Lord Commander of a new guard that promised to defend people rather than palaces. She stood in armor that had learned her shape and accepted oaths from men of no particular pedigree so long as they could hold a line. Jaime Lannister, if he had lived to say it, would have said she looked good in white. He did not live. He died in the city he had helped to make and unmake too many times. A man whose beautiful face had learned at the end to carry the weight of an ugly world. Tyrion became Hand because he did not know how not to be and because Daenerys chose to believe, again, that cleverness can be taught kindness and that kindness can be taught how to hold a quill without shaking. Grey Worm, who had once been a number and now had a name, left some of his men to keep order in a city that was learning how to be without being told what shape to occupy by fear. He took the rest across the sea to Noth because promises dead women make are still promises. They would guard the island. They would watch butterflies. They would put their spears down when they began to forget how to pick them up. In Winterfell, the hall smelled too clean once the smoke was gone. Sansa walked its length with a dog at her heels who had chosen her because dogs know where power is kind. She took petitions brought by men whose faces she had once known as boys. She listened to women whose marriages had taught them a patience that translated well to politics. She wrote letters in a hand that had learned to be steady even when the heart behind it yearned to shake lines. Arya did not stay long. She kissed Sansa's cheek and said, "I'll send you a story if I find one that doesn't smell too much of fish," and left on a ship with a captain who did not ask questions beyond those needed to keep his vessel upright. She took with her a map that ran out west of the last map any sensible person consulted and a promise she had made to herself the day she saw how small the world can feel when you are running through burning streets. Branv ent south once, not bodily, but enough that Daenerys felt his presence in the way her candle flared in a room with no drafts. He did not speak aloud. She understood because sometimes a queen is required to be a priest even if she does not believe in gods. Afterwards, she sat a long time with her fingers pressed to her eyelids until the bright colors that always lived there when she did that faded. She sent for Tyrion and asked him a question about sewer drains. He blinked and realized that this was the way of the world now. Gods and drains and grain and the heartbeats of people you would never meet all braided into the work of staying alive together. Jon went north. He did not take a retinue. He took Tormund and a handful of other men who had learned to sleep with one eye open and to trust wolves. ghost ran at his side with the confidence of a creature who knows that a world will make room for him if he insists. The air above the wall still hummed with the memory of a long, cold mind. Sometimes at night, the aurora laid its green hand across the snow like a woman smoothing a child's hair. The free folk built fires and took no orders and told jokes in which Southerners always died in ridiculous ways and laughed at each other until their ribs hurt. John learned again how to build a shelter out of nothing and how to sleep while cold watched. He learned how to find warmth where it lived, in a fire, in a cup, in a person, and to hold it carefully. He did not think about thrones except when he did, and then he was grateful for the cold, which has a way of stripping thoughts down to their bones. He thought of Daenerys sometimes with something stubborn and soft in his chest. He thought of her in rooms of ash and in halls of freshly cut wood, in the air with her beast under her and on foot among strangers. Letters came north with men who had business near the old castles. He read them by firelight and found in them laws and disagreements and the kind of gossip that makes cities feel like villages. He answered 5 to everyone he received, because he had made a habit of answering Sansa more often than she wrote, a quiet way of telling her that he remembered. Daenerys had the city cleaned. She had men with backbones and women with broom handles walk streets that had not yet learned to be safe at night and declare them passable. She set aside a corner of the Red Keep, what was left of it, for children, because there had been too many children in her stories and not enough in her rooms. She listened to singers because someone had to decide what the song about this time would be. She allowed the faith to build a place for prayer because people who do not have a place to talk to gods invent their own, and that can be a problem if you're trying to hold a city together without bleeding it. She did not make criminals out of poor men for being poor. She made criminals out of men who tried to make the poor useful for their own purposes and put them in front of other men to explain themselves. She did not always succeed at the careful work. Sometimes, late, she found herself at a window with tears freezing on her mouth because she could not forget the people she had killed for the sake of others living. Once a year, ships sailed north with things the South thought the North wanted. Grain and salted fish and a clockwork toy in the shape of a dragon some Bravosi had made with more skill than sense. Once a year, a messenger came south with things the North thought the South needed. A pelt with the smell of clean snow, a letter reminding everyone that there were stories older than the new ones, and once a dagger that had killed a king and then saved one. Daenerys held that dagger and thought of Arya's face like a blade. She returned it with a note. "When I forget mercy, remind me." She knew it would find its way to the right hand. The singers worked. The songs began to parse the way time had opened and did not quite close. They made of Arya a crow in coughs that stung and of Jon a wolf at a border where cold and law shook hands. They sang of Tyrion sitting at a table that was never quite steady and making it look like a stage. They sang of Sansa's quiet and called it winter's own music. They sang of Daenerys with more confusion than certainty, and that was right, because she was a collection of contradictions whose shadow spread over multiple rooms. Years passed, as they do. In the city, children learned to run the streets without thinking of fire as a living thing that might find them. In the north, the snow retreated as if someone had called it by its pet name. Men who had been boys when the dead walked began telling stories about the night as if it were something they had done on purpose. More than once, the living threatened to return to their old ways. It is what the living do. The Ironborn argued for wars that would sharpen them and were refused and sulked and then found other wars to sharpen themselves on. The Dornish flirted with treason and then with better food. The Reach produced a crop of poets as if the soil had decided to make words instead of wheat that year. When trouble came, as it must, it was quiet trouble first. A lord in the Crownlands told himself that the Queen was far and his men were near and declared he would not pay a certain tax. Daenerys sent a letter with a courtesy that could be mistaken for weakness. He sent back one with a rudeness that could be mistaken for strength. She flew not with Drogon but with a small company, sat in the Lord's hall, and listened to his reasons, which were not very good. She offered other reasons to him, which were better. He yielded because she had looked past him to the men on his benches and made them understand that she was not there to take their winter away, only their comfort keeping others in permanent winter. The next trouble was noisier. Men with old names gathered in a tower and looked at each other with the calculation of wolves sniffin'. "Gee, They spoke of the old ways with admiration that had no room for the old evils. Sansa's letter arrived in the middle of Daenerys' council. If the South begins to love the past too much, remind it that the past did not love the South. Tyrion snorted. He wrote back, I will remind them that nostalgia is a liar with good hair. When the first boy was born to a fisherman in Flea Bottom and named Aegon because the name had slid from the court down to the alleys and become shareable, Daenerys smiled and did not break. When the first girl was named Lyanna by a woman who had never seen a north beyond what the map under a glass had shown her, Jon laughed in a tent with a frozen flap and raised a cup to whoever had thought to send him the news. Not every story chooses the endings we would have chosen for it. Some choose to keep moving with a gait like a man who has been on a horse too long and cannot quite remember how to walk. Years later, a woman with hair no longer so bright as coins lay in a bed under a window and listened to the city breathe. She could not sleep for a time and did not mind. Tyrion, half asleep in a chair in the corner, made a small noise as if he had remembered a joke and then decided to save it for another day. She thought of a boy she had met on a cliff, and of the way he had refused to kneel because kneeling for him was not a compromise but a betrayal of the people who had given him a name. She thought of bells, of fire, of letters and drains, and always a single question that underlay every other. What do you owe the living? She did not know if she had answered it right. She knew she had tried. North of the wall, a man with white in his beard woke under the aurora and reached his hand out into extension of cold and calm. His hand met fur. Ghost lifted his head and huffed warm breath into the night. Tormund snored like a collapsing shed. The stars glinted like iron filings thrown across black cloth. Jon lay back and listened to a silence that was not unkind. He thought of Sansa in her hall, of Arya on a deck somewhere with birds fighting the wind above her, of Bran at a tree that had decided to be a man again, and of a woman in a southern city who had learned that thrones are only chairs that make your back ache. The North did not bend. It reached. It sent men and women south to learn trades and bring them back north. It repaid grain sent in winter with counsel in summer and steel in autumn when bandits decided to test how much a border could be asked to forgive. It kept its godswood and allowed one temple to the seven to be built in White Harbor because the North had learned that a small compromise in stone is not treason to a tree. Children learned to shoot arrows and to say please and to put meat up in autumn in case winter decided to be cruel one year simply because it could. If there were nights when Daenerys stood at a window and wished the North had bent because the story would have been cleaner, there were mornings when she sat in council and thanked every god that it had not, because the world is stronger when it contains an honorable no that refuses to become a yes even when the yes might remove difficulties. If there were days when Jon wished he had used a crown to make people do what he knew they ought, there were more when he watched a free folk child throw a stone so accurately that a rabbit changed its mind about which way to run and felt something like love for all the ways human beings insist on being as they are. On a summer's day that felt like someone had forgotten to wind the weather and left it stuck on Pleasant, Jon came south to the neck and met Daenerys there. They stood on soft ground that had eaten armies once and now held them both as if it had decided to forgive. There were soldiers behind them, and singers, and somewhere a boy who would swear later he had seen a dragon blink and smile. They did not talk about the night. They did not talk about who they had been. They had learned that lovers of ghosts seldom dine well. They spoke of bridges and of how wide they should be to allow carts to pass each other in both directions without one backing up into the mud. They spoke of taxes as if taxes could be discussed without killing love. Do you ever wish? Daenerys began and stopped. She had learned, at last, to leave sentences unfinished when finishing them would turn the air into glass that might cut someone when it shattered. Jon said, because he had learned to finish gently, I wish many things. I am glad for more. The North is alive. The South is alive. There are children who do not know the sound of dead things walking. You sit a throne that makes your back ache, and I sleep on rocks. We made a world we can both endure. You never bent, she said softly, not in accusation but in acknowledgement. You never asked me to at the end, he replied, and they both smiled. They parted with no grand promises spoken into wind. He went north and she went south. In the months that followed, parchments traveled with their words on them. A note about a village in the Riverlands where a magistrate had taken more than he was owed and been corrected. A message about a forest fire near the wall and how many trees had been lost and would grow again. a childish drawing enclosed with one letter, perhaps the work of a councilman's daughter, of a dragon and a wolf both looking slightly like cows. They sang, in the corners of the world, of a night that had ended because a girl had stabbed a place beneath a king's ribs. They sang, as people must, also of what came after. And if those songs were not as grand, if they contained more verses about drains and crops than about fire, that was a blessing the living had earned.